Airport security mocked the old veteran's ID until a general's motorcade stopped cold. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside. This ID is not valid government-issued identification." The voice cut through the terminal noise the way a fire alarm cuts through conversation, not because it was loud, but because it was aimed. Clipped, slick with the practiced authority of someone who has learned to make ordinary people feel like problems. SA Officer Marcus Webb was 29 years old and stood behind the security checkpoint at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, with the particular posture of a man who has recently completed additional training and intends you to know it. He held the card between two fingers and turned it slightly. The way a man turns something over to show it doesn't weigh anything. Thomas Alcott was 82 years old. He stood at the checkpoint in a plain gray cardigan, dark trousers with a crease that had been pressed in that morning, and a pair of black Oxford shoes that had been resoled twice and shone like still water. His carry-on, a single soft bag, navy canvas, worn at the handles, sat on the conveyor behind him. His hands were at his sides, the knuckles large and weathered, the fingers absolutely still. He had not reacted to being told to step aside. He was simply there, the way a fixed point is simply there, not making an argument out of its existence. The morning terminal at Reagan National smelled of coffee and jet fuel and the recycled air warmth of a building that processes 40,000 people a day and stopped noticing them individually long ago. The security line stretched back 30 people. Overhead screens cycled through departure times with the indifference of infrastructure. Beyond the checkpoint, gates and coffee kiosks and moving walkways conducted their ordinary business, indifferent to what was happening at the checkpoint in the way airports are indifferent to everything, except the schedule. A second SA officer, younger, a trainee whose name tag read Diaz, leaned over and looked at the card. Something moved in his face. He looked up at the old man, then back at the card, then at Webb. He started to say something. Webb talked over him. "The issue, sir," Webb said, raising his voice just enough to carry to the people behind Thomas Alcott in the line, making the situation slightly larger than it needed to be, in the way that people do when they want an audience to validate them, "is that this is not a standard form of government ID. I cannot accept non-standard identification at a federal security checkpoint. I'm sure you understand." He set the card on the counter with the flat, definitive click of a man closing a subject. "Do you have a current driver's license or a passport?" Thomas Alcott looked at the card on the counter. Then he looked at Webb. His eyes were gray, the color of deep water in winter, and they held a quality that had nothing to do with the situation in front of him. A depth like looking down into something that had been forming for a very long time and was not going to be altered by a Tuesday morning at an airport security checkpoint. He looked at Webb the way weather looks at a building, without intention and without urgency, and with a thoroughness that left nothing unexamined. "That identification," Thomas said, and his voice was a low and even thing, like a river that has been moving in one direction for so long that the direction is no longer a decision, was issued by the Department of Defense. It is valid at every federal facility in the United States and at every military installation in every country where we have a status of forces agreement. He paused. "I don't carry a driver's license. I haven't needed one since 1987. Webb picked the card back up. He turned it over again, slowly, for the benefit of the growing awareness in the line behind them. "Sir, I understand that you believe this is valid identification, and I am not questioning your sincerity." He said this with a particular tone that communicates that he is, in fact, questioning it. "But I have a procedure to follow, and the procedure requires government-issued photo ID of a standard form. And this card," he turned it to show the woman in line behind Thomas Alcott, and she obligingly looked and he continued, is not a form I am authorized to accept. Thomas Alcott said nothing. He looked at the card in Webb's hand with the expression of a man watching something handle an object carelessly that it does not understand. I'm going to need you to either produce standard identification, Webb said, or step out of the line and contact the airline's accessibility desk, who can, it's a CAC card, said the man 3 positions back in the line, an Army captain in uniform, who had gone quiet and still as the situation developed, and who was now deciding that quiet and still was no longer the right choice. His voice was controlled and flat and not friendly. Common access card. It's a duddy credential. It's valid federal ID. Sir, I appreciate your input, Webb said, without looking at the captain, but I will need you to remain in your position in the line. He turned back to Thomas Alcott and reached forward and touched the card's lanyard, which Thomas wore looped around his wrist, the card hanging from it like a compass, and took hold of it gently, but with the implication of possession. If you'll just, the card was connected to the lanyard. The lanyard was around Thomas Alcott's wrist. The gesture had been designed to be ambiguous, and it had achieved that ambiguity. The smell of jet fuel dropped away. The hall was long and institutional and smelled of floor wax and the particular stillness of a building that has been built to last and knows it. He was 21 years old, and he was standing at the end of a hallway in the Pentagon, a hallway that he had been escorted to, that he had been told to stand in and wait, that he had been given no additional information about, in dress uniform that he had pressed himself that morning, the shoes the same black Oxford pair he had in his kit since his first posting. It was 1963. He had been in the Army for 4 years, doing intelligence work in locations and circumstances that did not appear in his service record, doing things that needed doing and had not been examined over much because examination had not been the appropriate response at the time. He did not yet know what this hallway would produce. What it produced was a colonel, Hargrove, who came out of an office door with the specific urgency of a man who has information he has not yet decided how to deliver. Compact, direct, with the eyes of someone who has worked in intelligence long enough that directness is a form of respect. Alcott, Hargrove said. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at him. 3 months ago, in a building you were never in, during an operation that is not in any record, you made a judgment call that preserved the operational security of an asset that was irreplaceable. You made that call correctly. You made it correctly and quickly and without guidance and under conditions that were not survivable for most people in that position. He paused. I want you to understand that I know that, and that the people who needed to know. He reached into his jacket and produced a lanyard and card, a new one, the kind of card that did not yet exist in the general vocabulary of military identification, the prototype of a thing that would not become standard issue for another 2 decades. The card had Thomas's photograph and a line of authorization text and a classification code that Thomas did not recognize and would not recognize for several more years. This will open every door you ever need opened, Hargrove said, in this building and in every building that answers to it. He held it out. Carry it. Thomas took it. It was lighter than it looked. Sir, he said, the asset is safe, Hargrove said, because of you. He turned to go back through the door. Then he stopped, hand on the frame, without turning around. The work you do is not the kind that gets talked about, he said. That's not an apology. That's the nature of it. The people who do it know, and that has to be enough. He went back through the door. The officer who had escorted Thomas to the hallway appeared from around the corner and looked at the card in his hand and looked at Thomas and said nothing. which was itself a form of information. Thomas held the card. It was lighter than it looked, and it was heavier than it looked. 4 months later, in a different country, in a building that did not exist, a man who had given Thomas everything he knew about operational field intelligence, a case officer named Edward Cahill, 37 years old, who had the habit of correcting people's grammar in the middle of crisis situations, and who had twice kept Thomas alive through the force of his own refusal to accept that the situation was as bad as it appeared, made a decision that Thomas had advised against and was killed in the consequences of it. He was right that Thomas had been right. He was not alive to say so. Thomas Alcott had carried the card since that morning in the hallway. 59 years. He blinked. The terminal came back. The overhead screens. The departure times. Webb's hand on the lanyard. The Army captain 3 positions back in the line was Captain James Okafor, 28 years old, who had been watching this situation develop with the mounting discomfort of someone who recognizes an injustice and has been trying to determine the appropriate channel for addressing it, and has just decided that the appropriate channel is himself. He had seen what was on the card when Webb held it up for the woman in line behind Thomas Alcott. He had seen the classification marker on the card's lower right. He had seen it and understood what he was seeing in the way that people understand things they were trained to understand. He was not in a position to confront Webb directly. That was a different chain of command, and confronting it would produce a scene that would not serve the old man. But Okafor had a contact in the Pentagon duty office given to him for exactly the category of situation that was not supposed to happen, but occasionally did. And this situation had the texture of that category. He stepped half out of the line, his carry-on in one hand, and made the call. It rang once. Pentagon duty, Sergeant Whitfield. Sergeant, this is Captain Okafor. I'm at Reagan National, Terminal B Security. I need you to run a name for me right now. Thomas Alcott. He's standing at a Texas checkpoint, and they're holding his CAC, and I need you to tell me what that card says about him. The silence on the other end was not the silence of a name being looked up. It was the silence of a name being recognized. It arrived between syllables, and it lasted for 3 full seconds, and when Sergeant Whitfield's voice returned it, had been entirely reorganized. Captain, say that again. Thomas Alcott. Thomas Alcott. He's 82, he's at. Do not let that checkpoint process him through normal secondary screening. Are you hearing me? Do not let them run him through secondary. I need his exact location in the terminal, and I need you to stay on this line. There was background noise now. The kind of background noise that is a room changing its posture. I'm making a call. It goes straight to General Foster's Chief of Staff. This is going to move fast, Captain. Stay where you are. Whitfield's call lasted 45 seconds. In the Joint Chiefs Suite, General Foster's Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Cole, who had served with Thomas Alcott in circumstances not on any record, heard the name and said 3 words: "Get the motorcade." Then, he was moving. General Foster, 4 stars, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was in a vehicle on the 395 bridge when his phone rang, and Cole said a name he had not heard in 19 years, and the general said, "Stop the car." The car stopped. Okafor stood in the line and held his phone and waited, and watched Thomas Alcott stand at the checkpoint with his hands at his sides and his card on the counter, and his expression unchanged. The gray eyes. The absolute stillness of a man who has been in considerably more difficult situations than this one, and found them navigable. Webb had escalated to his supervisor by now, a heavy-set man named Garrett, who had arrived with the expression of someone accustomed to managing small situations and was beginning to suspect this was not a small situation. The Army captain at Position 3 had gotten out of the line entirely. The 30 people behind Thomas Alcott had the communal quality of witnesses. Not intervening, not leaving, holding the space and the uncertainty together. Webb had produced a form. He was explaining the form. His voice had acquired the additional layer of bureaucratic certainty that people add when they begin to sense that their certainty is not as solid as it was. Thomas Alcott had not moved, had not argued, had not threatened or pleaded or raised his voice. He stood with his carry-on at his side and the card on the counter and the lanyard looped around his wrist, and he looked. To anyone who had not been watching carefully for the last 12 minutes, like an old man waiting patiently for a routine matter to be resolved. To anyone who had been watching carefully, he looked like a man who knew something that the room did not yet know, and was allowing the room to arrive at its own conclusions in its own time. The sound came from the terminal's main entrance, not from inside the security checkpoint, but from outside it, from the departures level drop-off where, normally, nothing happened that was not a car pulling up or a car pulling away. What was happening now was not that. What was happening was a motorcade. 2 black Chevy Suburbans with federal plates, a command car between them, 2 trail vehicles behind, lights running, moving with the urgency of vehicles that do not stop at departures levels. Doors opened before they fully stopped. The people stepping out moved with the particular economy of Federal Protection Detail personnel who have been told that speed is required. 6 figures came through the terminal's main doors. They moved through the departures hall with the contained urgency of a weather front. And the people in the departures hall, the families with rolling luggage, the business travelers, the airport staff, registered them and made space without being asked, the way people make space for something that communicates its own necessity. 2 of the 6 peeled off at the checkpoint perimeter. The others continued. Brigadier General Raymond Cole, Chief of Staff to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was the first through the checkpoint entrance. He was 53 years old, silver-haired, and moved with the absolute purposeful calm of a man who is doing something he has been wanting to do since the moment he heard the name on the phone. He came through the checkpoint line. The TSA supervisor, Garrett, said something and was not responded to, and his eyes found Thomas Alcott, and they did not move from him. He walked directly to Thomas. He did not look at Webb. He did not look at the card on the counter. He did not address the supervisor or the form that Webb was still technically holding. He walked to the old man in the gray cardigan and stopped 3 feet from him, and Thomas Alcott looked at him, and something passed between them that was not translatable into the language of the terminal, the recognition that passes between people who have been in rooms that don't exist and done things that aren't recorded and carried those rooms and those things for decades. He saw Webb's earlier touch on the lanyard, the mark of it registered in his face. He turned. He looked at Webb with a gaze that required no additional equipment to communicate what it contained. Webb set the form down. Brigadier General Raymond Cole came to attention in front of Thomas Alcott and rendered the sharpest, most breathtakingly precise salute that Marcus Webb had ever seen in any context, including every piece of military media he had consumed in his 29 years. It was not a salute that acknowledged a superior. It was a salute that acknowledged a weight, something so heavy and so long carried that the act of honoring it required the body to be exactly correct. He held it directed at the old man in the gray cardigan and the resoled Oxford shoes. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. The terminal did not go quiet exactly. The terminal was too large and too indifferent to go fully quiet, but the checkpoint and the 30 feet in every direction around it went quiet in a way that was complete. Thomas Alcott raised his right hand, weathered, large-knuckled, the stillness in it total, and returned the salute. He lowered it. Cole lowered his. Webb's form was still in his hand. He had forgotten it was there. General Cole reached into his jacket and produced a document, not a single page, but several, folded together, and he unfolded them without rushing. He addressed the checkpoint. He addressed Webb and the supervisor and the captain and the 30 people in the line and everyone within earshot, because this was not a conversation that deserved to be private. Thomas Edward Alcott, he said. His official service designation is classified at a level requiring authorization to access, and I am not going to read you his file, because most of his file doesn't leave the building it lives in. What I am authorized to tell you, what I am here to tell you, is this. He looked at the first page. Thomas Alcott served this country in intelligence operations from 1959 to 1991. 32 years. The nature of intelligence work is that it cannot be publicly decorated. The people who do it do not receive ceremonies, because the ceremonies would identify them, and the identification would endanger them and the people they protected. He turned a page. This man was present in operations across 4 decades and 3 continents that preserved American lives in numbers not available for public disclosure. This building, he gestured, encompassing the Pentagon and everything behind it, has a room with a wall, and on that wall are stars representing intelligence officers killed in service, who cannot be named. Thomas Alcott put 2 of those stars on that wall himself, carrying people out of situations they would not otherwise have survived, at cost to himself that is also not on any record. He folded the pages. The card he carries was issued by the Office of the Secretary of Defense in 1963. It has been valid every day since. It is valid at this checkpoint. It was valid 30 minutes ago when you declined it. He put the document away. The enemy had a name for him. In 3 countries, across 3 decades, the agencies he operated against called him Ingi Kong Ten T. He let the syllables stand. The man who does not exist. Because he moved through their operations and their facilities, and they could not account for him. Because the work was done, and the people were safe, and they could not explain how. A pause. That is the man you asked to step aside. The checkpoint was absolutely still. Cole turned to the supervisor. His identification is accepted. He boards his flight. The supervisor said, "Yes, sir," with the vocal quality of someone trying to make several things simultaneously true. The formal review of Webb's conduct began the following week and involved, in addition to standard TSOP procedures, an inquiry from a federal oversight office that did not typically involve itself in checkpoint incidents. Webb was not dismissed. The review found no malice. Only ignorance stacked on arrogance stacked on an audience that made the ignorance harder to correct. He was required to complete a Federal Identification Standards recertification, a workshop on credential recognition, and a supervised period his supervisor described privately as a chance to become the officer you could be, rather than the one you were today. Thomas Alcott boarded his flight. At the gate, Cole walked with him as far as the boarding door. Men who have shared certain kinds of history do not need to fill the silence. At the door, Cole stopped. "Edward Cahill's daughter is at Georgetown," he said. "International relations. She knows her father was a good man. She doesn't know the specifics. She knows he was good." He looked at Thomas. "I thought you should know." Thomas Alcott looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "The way a man says something he has been waiting to hear for 19 years. He went through the boarding door. It was 6 weeks later, a Saturday morning, at a coffee shop in Arlington, exposed brick, ground coffee smell, the quiet that the city's weekdays do not allow. Webb was in civilian clothes at a table near the window, with the particular stillness of a man who has spent 6 weeks being considerably more thoughtful than he was before a given Tuesday. He had read what could be read. He understood now, in the approximate way a person can understand something that lives mostly in classified basements, the weight of what he had been carelessly handling. He saw the gray cardigan through the window before the door opened. He was outside before his coffee cooled. Mr. Alcott. Thomas Alcott turned from the direction of the entrance and looked at him with the winter gray eyes. No warmth, no coldness. The depth that simply was. Webb stopped on the Arlington sidewalk with no uniform and no procedure to stand behind. "I owe you an apology," he said. "The way I handled your identification, the way I performed it for the line, I was more interested in being seen as correct than in being correct. I treated your credential as a prop." He looked at the man. "I'm sorry." Thomas Alcott looked at him the way he had looked at him at the checkpoint, with a thoroughness that left nothing unexamined, and then nodded once. The nod of a man who has accepted many things and understands that acceptance is not absolution, but makes the next thing possible. "You were young and sure of yourself," Thomas said. "That combination produces mistakes. It's not a defect. It's a stage. The question is whether you learn from it or keep performing it." Webb had nothing to add. "Go get your coffee," Thomas said. "It's good here." He was already moving, with the unhurried purposefulness of a man who has somewhere to be and has always known how to get there. Webb watched him go. He watched until the gray cardigan turned the corner and was gone. And then he stood on the Arlington sidewalk for a moment in the November morning, holding the apology he had just made and the answer he had just received, and he understood that he had been given something, and that the appropriate response was not to talk about it, but to carry it. The people who kept this country's secrets so that other people could keep their lives do not walk around announcing the weight of what they carry. They are in coffee shops and airport terminals, and they are dressed like everybody else, and they hold a credential that most people would not recognize, and they do not explain themselves, because explanation has never been how the work gets done. They are old and they are quiet, and the lanyard is around their wrist because they have not decided to stop carrying it yet. We don't always deserve them. They show up anyway. If you are moved by Thomas's story of quiet courage and timeless wisdom, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and be sure to subscribe to Veterans Valor for more stories of America's unassuming heroes. And click that notification bell so you never miss a story of the quiet warriors who walk among us.